She arrived with 2 children, a broken suitcase, and a dead man's name, and every single person on that ranch expected her to be gone within a week. The wind off the northern plains doesn't care who you are. It doesn't care that you buried your husband 3 weeks ago, that your daughter stopped speaking the day of the funeral, or that your son hasn't slept a full night since. It hits you the same way it hits everyone, hard, flat, and without apology. Elena Ashcroft stepped down from that wagon into the mud of Cold River Ranch and felt the wind try to push her back the direction she came from. She didn't move. She planted both feet in the dirt and looked up at the man standing on the porch with his arms crossed and his jaw set like stone. If this story speaks to your heart, hit that like button, drop a comment with the city you're watching from, and follow along until the very end. I want to see just how far this story travels. The wagon had smelled like wet canvas and old straw for 3 days. Elena had stopped noticing it somewhere around the second afternoon when the road turned from packed dirt to nothing more than 2 mud ruts cutting through buffalo grass that went on forever in every direction. Before that, she'd been holding herself together by focusing on small, manageable things. Keeping Nora's blanket tucked around her shoulders, making sure Thomas ate the dried biscuits she'd wrapped in cloth, counting fence posts when there were fence posts to count. But once the fence posts disappeared and the grass swallowed the horizon whole, there was nothing left to focus on except the fact that she had no idea what waited for her at the end of this road. The letter from Garrick Rowan had been exactly 11 lines long. She had memorized it not because she wanted to, but because she'd read it so many times during those 3 days in the wagon that the words had pressed themselves into her mind whether she invited them or not. Mrs. Ashcroft, your husband worked for me 2 seasons before he went east. He was a reliable man. I understand your situation has become difficult. I can offer a position managing the household and cooking for my crew. The work is hard and the location is remote. I don't make promises I can't keep, but I won't turn a woman and her children away in winter. You would have a roof. G. Rowan. Not warm, not unkind, precise, the way a man writes when he's measured every word before committing it to paper. She had written back with equal precision. Mr. Rowan, I accept. I will arrive the second week of November. I can cook, preserve, manage a household, and treat basic injuries and illness. I will earn whatever shelter you provide. E. Ashcroft. What she hadn't written, that she'd sold almost everything to pay for the journey, that the broken suitcase the wagon driver had hauled onto the bench beside her contained 2 changes of clothes for each child, a set of her own practical dresses, a tin box of medicinal herbs and dried preparations her mother had spent 30 years accumulating, and a small framed portrait of James that she hadn't looked at once since leaving Ohio. What she hadn't written was that she was 29 years old and had never been further west than the edge of her father's property, and that the furthest edge of her father's property had been exactly 4 miles from the town where she was born. But she had come anyway. Cold River Ranch appeared first as a dark smear against the gray November sky. A cluster of structures that slowly resolved into a main house, a long bunkhouse, a barn, and several outbuildings arranged around a yard that had been churned into deep mud by horses and boots and wagon wheels. There was a corral to the left with 6 horses watching the approaching wagon with that flat, evaluating look that horses have. There was a well in the center of the yard. There was a crow sitting on the roof of the main house that didn't fly away when the wagon pulled in. And there was Garrick Rowan on the porch. He was taller than she'd expected, though she wasn't sure why she'd expected anything specific from 11 lines of careful handwriting. He had the kind of face that had spent most of its life in weather, tan to leather, with deep lines around the eyes and mouth that weren't from smiling. He was maybe 40, maybe older. It was hard to tell. His hair was dark with some gray at the temples, and he hadn't shaved in what looked like several days. His arms were crossed over his chest, and he was watching the wagon the way a man watches something he hasn't decided about yet. The driver, a taciturn man named Burl, who'd said maybe 30 words total over 3 days, hauled the wagon to a stop and looked at Elena with something that might have been sympathy if he'd been the sympathetic type. End of the line, ma'am. Elena looked at the mud between the wagon step and the porch. She looked at Nora, who was 5 years old and had not spoken a single word since the morning of James's funeral 6 weeks ago. She looked at Thomas, who was 8 and currently pretending to be asleep, which he'd been doing whenever he didn't want to feel something difficult. "Thomas," she said quietly, "I know you're awake." A long pause, Then her son opened his eyes and sat up, looking out at the ranch with the careful measuring expression he'd inherited directly from his father, which every single time she saw it put a small crack somewhere behind her sternum. "It's muddy," he said. "Yes." "The barn looks crooked." She looked. It did lean slightly to the left. "We're not here for the barn." She climbed down first, because that was the kind of thing she'd learned to do without thinking about it. Go first. Show them it's safe. Deal with her own fear as a private matter. Her boots sank an inch into the mud. She reached up for Nora, who came to her without resistance, with the quiet compliance that worried Elena far more than tantrums would have. Thomas climbed down on his own and stood beside her, their three shapes in a row in the cold river yard, mud-spattered and travel-worn, and probably nothing like what any of these people had been expecting. Garrick Rowan came off the porch. He had a long, unhurried stride, the kind that covered ground without looking like it was trying to. He stopped about 6 feet away and looked at her. Not rudely, not with the kind of open assessment that some men use to make a woman feel inspected, more like he was trying to match what he saw to something he already had in his head, and the two things weren't quite fitting together. "Mrs. Ashcroft," he said. "Mr. Rowan. You made it." "I said I would." Something shifted very slightly in his expression. He nodded once. Then he looked at the children. At Thomas first, who looked straight back at him with James's brown eyes and James's stubborn jaw, and then at Nora, who had her face pressed against Elena's shoulder and was studying him sideways from under her lashes. "Kids eat supper?" he asked. "Not since this morning." He nodded again, as if that was a thing that needed to be addressed before anything else. He turned and looked back at the porch, where two ranch hands had materialized and were leaning against the railing with the studied casualness of men who were absolutely watching everything. "Holt," Garrick said. "Get their bag inside. Supper's in an hour." The younger of the two men, lean, with red hair, and an expression somewhere between curious and skeptical, unpeeled himself from the railing and came down into the mud without much enthusiasm. He picked up Elena's suitcase from where Burl had set it, hefted it once, and looked at her like he was doing arithmetic. "This all you got?" "That's all," Elena said. Holt looked at Garrick. Garrick looked at Holt with a flat expression that communicated something Elena couldn't quite read, but Holt apparently could, because he picked up the suitcase and carried it inside without another word. The other ranch hand, older, heavier, with a gray beard and the kind of permanent squint that comes from decades of staring at open country, had not moved from the railing. He watched Elena with undisguised doubt. "I'm Pete Calloway," he said. "Cook. Or I was, up until 20 minutes ago. Elena Ashcroft. You know what you're doing in a kitchen?" "I know what I'm doing in a kitchen. Ranch kitchen's different from a farmhouse kitchen." "I imagine it is," she said. "I'll figure out the differences." Pete Calloway chewed on that for a moment and then disappeared inside without offering an opinion. Garrick had watched this exchange with the same unreadable expression. Now he looked at Elena again, and this time there was something slightly different in it. Not warmth, exactly, but a kind of recalibration. "The room's small," he said. "North side of the house. One bed, but there's a cot. It's not much." "It's a roof," Elena said. "That's what you promised." He held her gaze for a second. "Yeah," he said. "It is." He turned and went back up the porch steps. At the top, without turning around, he said, "Supper bell's at 6. Ranch hands eat first." And that was her welcome to Cold River Ranch. The room was small. He hadn't oversold that. It had one window that looked north, which Elena would later understand meant it got no direct sun at any point in the day, and was therefore reliably the coldest room in the house. The bed was a narrow iron frame with a decent mattress. She pressed on it and was relieved to find it was actually decent, not just described as decent. The cot was wooden with a thin pallet. There was a hook on the back of the door and a small washstand with a chipped pitcher. Thomas stood in the center of the room and turned in a slow circle, evaluating. "It's small," he said. "It's ours," Elena said. She set Nora down on the bed and started unbuttoning the child's coat. "That makes it enough." Thomas sat on the cot. It creaked alarmingly, and he stood back up immediately, alarmed, then sat down more carefully. It held. "Mama," he said. He had his father's voice too, low and direct, even at 8 years old, even when he was scared. Are we staying here forever? Elena pulled Nora's coat off and folded it. I don't know about forever, she said, but we're staying. What if they don't want us here? She looked at her son across the small, cold room. The honest answer was that she wasn't sure anyone here wanted them. Not the skeptical Calloway, not the assessing Holt, and maybe not even Garrick Rowan, who had clearly done this out of some kind of obligation to her dead husband's memory rather than any genuine desire for a widow and 2 children under his roof. But she didn't say that. Then we'll make ourselves useful enough that it doesn't matter what they want, she said. Come here, let me get that mud off your coat. Supper that first night was a revelation, and not a flattering one. The food itself wasn't bad. Calloway clearly knew how to feed a crew, and the elk stew that came out of the pot was thick and well seasoned. But the dynamic at the table was something Elena had to study and understand quickly, the way you study terrain you're going to have to navigate. There were 6 ranch hands in total. Pete Calloway, who had appointed himself spokesman for the group's collective skepticism. Red-haired Holt Dewey, 22 or 23, who kept sneaking looks at Elena and then looking away when she caught him. A quiet, heavy-set man named Darby, who barely spoke but ate with impressive focus. 2 brothers from Texas, Sam and Cade Mercer, who were friendly enough on the surface but had an undertone of amusement when they looked at her, the kind that said, "Let's see how long this lasts." And an older man named Dutch, who had a bad leg from some old injury and moved around the bunkhouse with a crutch, and who was the only one who didn't look at Elena like she was a problem waiting to announce itself. "Dutch Harlan," he said when he sat across from her, extending a hand directly over the table the way people do when they've decided to skip the ceremony. "Don't mind them," he said, tilting his head at the general direction of the other hands. "They're not bad men. They just don't know what to do with you yet." "They'll figure it out," Elena said. Dutch smiled. He had missing teeth on the left side and laugh lines deep enough to hold water. "You always this sure of yourself?" "No," she said. "But I'm good at sounding like I am." He laughed. A real laugh, sudden and genuine. Across the table, Holt looked up from his stew, then back down. Garrick sat at the head of the table and said almost nothing. He ate efficiently, listened to whatever the Mercer brothers were saying about the north fence, and looked at Elena exactly twice during the entire meal. Once when Dutch laughed, and once when Nora knocked over her cup of water, and Elena caught it without making a sound or a fuss, righted it, and mopped up the water with the practical, unhurried motions of a woman who had caught 100 knocked-over cups. After supper, when the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and the children were asleep, Elena cleaned the kitchen. This was not something she'd been asked to do. Calloway had made it clear, not rudely, but clearly, that the kitchen was his territory and had been for 6 years, and he wasn't entirely certain what her presence was supposed to change. But the dishes were there, and the pot needed scrubbing, and the floor had tracked mud that would be 10 times harder to clean in the morning, so she did it. Methodically, quietly, without announcement. She was finishing the floor when she heard boots on the boards behind her and turned to find Garrick Rowan standing in the kitchen doorway with a coffee cup in his hand, looking at her. "You don't have to do that tonight," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm doing it anyway." He leaned against the door frame. He was still in the same clothes he'd been in all day, ranch clothes, worn and practical, and he had a tiredness around the eyes that wasn't just the tiredness of one long day. "Your husband," he said, and then stopped. Elena kept her hands moving on the mop. "James," she said. "James." He said the name carefully, like he was making sure he had it right. "He talked about you." She looked up. That surprised her enough that she stopped moving. "What did he say?" Garrick seemed to consider the question with more seriousness than she'd expected. "Said you were the most capable person he'd ever met," he said. "Said the only thing wrong with you was that you didn't believe it." Elena looked down at the floor. "He also said you'd clean my kitchen before you'd even unpacked," Garrick said. And there was something in his voice that wasn't quite humor, but was in the neighborhood of it. He was right about that, too. She didn't know what to say to that. She wasn't sure there was anything to say. "I won't make promises about how this goes," Garrick said. He set his cup on the counter. "I don't know how this goes, but you're here, and your children are here, and we'll figure it out." That's all I'm asking, she said. He nodded once, like a man closing a discussion. He picked up his cup and walked back out, and his boots faded down the hallway, and Elena was alone in the kitchen with the mop and the smell of lye soap and the sound of the wind pressing against the outside walls like it was checking for weak spots. She stood there for a moment, then she finished the floor. The first week was the hardest, and the hardest part wasn't the work. Elena woke before sunrise because the kitchen needed to be running before the hands ate, and Calloway, while willing to tolerate her presence, had made it quietly clear that his routine was his routine, and she could find her own space within it or around it. She found it around it, getting up while the house was dark and cold and getting the fire going and the first pot of coffee on, so that when Calloway appeared at 5:30 with his gray beard and his permanent squint, the kitchen was already warm. He didn't thank her. She didn't expect him to. The children adjusted with the specific resilience of children who have learned that adjusting is the only real option. Thomas found Darby, the quiet, heavy-set man, to be a source of fascination. Darby had an almost supernatural calm around horses, and within 3 days, Thomas was following him to the corral after lessons and standing at the fence watching with intense focus. Darby never said much to him, but he didn't send him away either. Nora was harder. Nora was 5 and silent and had been since the morning Elena had sat down with both children on the edge of the bed in her sister's Ohio house and told them, as plainly and gently as she could, that their father wasn't coming home. Thomas had cried, hard, angry, bewildered tears that broke Elena's heart, and also, somehow, reassured her. Nora had simply stopped talking, not in a dramatic way. She hadn't screamed or refused. She just closed that door quietly and hadn't opened it again. She communicated with looks and gestures and the occasional tug on Elena's sleeve. She ate. She slept. She watched everything with enormous, careful dark eyes that were pure Elena and nothing of James. The ranch made Nora nervous at first. The noise, the size of it, the unfamiliar men moving through the yard. She stayed close to Elena and watched from doorways. But by the end of the first week, she had identified the one corner of the main house's front porch that was sheltered from the wind and had adopted it as her territory, sitting there in the afternoons wrapped in her coat with a stick she'd found, drawing shapes in the dirt at the porch's edge. Nobody bothered her there, not even Pete Calloway, who had walked past that corner 6 times a day his entire life, and now simply walked past a small silent girl doing it. Elena noticed that Garrick, riding in from the eastern pastures one afternoon, stopped his horse near the porch and looked at Nora for a long moment. Nora looked back at him. He didn't say anything. He just nodded at her, the same single nod he'd given Elena that first night, and rode on to the barn. Nora watched him go. Then she looked back at her dirt drawings. But Elena found the garden by accident. She'd been looking for the cold cellar. Calloway had mentioned it in the oblique way he mentioned most things, as if she should already know where it was, and had gone around the wrong side of the house and found herself at the edge of what had once been a substantial kitchen garden. It was dead now, obviously. Late November, nothing growing. But the structure was there, the raised beds built with solid timber framing that hadn't rotted, the path between them still clear of major weeds, the whole thing protected on 3 sides by the house wall and a windbreak fence that had been put up with deliberate care. Somebody had loved this garden. She crouched down and turned over some of the bed soil with her fingers. Under the frost-killed surface layer, it was dark and well-worked. Not natural. Someone had built this soil over years. At supper that night, she asked, casually, "Who built the garden on the south side of the house?" Something happened at the table. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody moved or made a sound. But there was a shift in the air, the specific kind of shift that happens when you ask a question that everyone knows the answer to and nobody wants to be the one to give it. It was Dutch who answered, and he answered carefully. "That was Mrs. Rowan's garden," he said. "Catherine. She built it the second year they were here. Kept it going right up until—" He paused. "She passed 6 years ago. Hasn't been touched since." Elena looked at Garrick. He was looking at his plate. His jaw was set at an angle she'd seen before, that angle that said this topic is not open, and he was absolutely not going to look up. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it simply, without drama. Garrick looked up then, brief, flat. "It's a good location for a garden," he said. "South-facing, protected." He looked back at his plate. If you want to use it, use it. That was all he said. But it was something. Elena understood that. She'd learned in 7 days that with Garrick Rowan, what he didn't say mattered as much as what he did. And use it from a man who hadn't let anyone near his dead wife's garden in 6 years was, in its own hard-to-articulate way, a kind of trust. She didn't push it. She didn't say thank you in a way that would make it larger than he'd offered it. She just nodded and said, "I'll start clearing it in the spring then." And Garrick said, and the table moved on. But across the table, Dutch caught her eye and gave her the smallest possible nod of approval, and Holt looked up from his biscuits with an expression she couldn't quite name, and even Pete Calloway, who had given very little away all week, paused for half a second before reaching for the salt. Elena looked at the middle distance and kept her face calm and thought, this is how you do it. Not all at once. Not by demanding anything, one small piece of ground at a time. The wind pressed against the kitchen window. The lamp threw warm light across the table. Her son was talking to Darby about horses, and her daughter was eating quietly, methodically, alive. It wasn't a home yet, but it was a start. December came to Cold River Ranch the way it always did on the northern plains. Not gradually, not with any kind of warning you could actually use, but all at once, like a door slamming shut on everything warm. Elena had been at this ranch 3 weeks when the temperature dropped 20 degrees in a single night. She woke to ice on the inside of the window glass, and Nora pressed against her side like a small furnace. And she lay there in the dark for a few minutes, listening to the wind work at the eaves, before she got up, dressed in the dark, and went to start the kitchen fire. She had developed a routine by then, which was the only way she knew how to hold things together. Routine as structure. Structure as sanity. Up before 5. Fire going. Coffee on. Biscuits or cornbread started before Calloway appeared. The first week he'd walked into his kitchen to find her already there and had said nothing. The second week he'd started leaving the flour canister where she could reach it without climbing. That was as close to acceptance as Pete Calloway got, and she'd learned to read it as exactly that. She had also learned the ranch, not just the physical layout, where the cold cellar was finally, and where the tool shed kept its secrets, and which of the 3 water pumps froze first in cold weather, but the rhythms of it, who was up at what hour, who needed quiet in the mornings, and who needed to talk. The way Garrick's boots sounded on the porch boards told her, after 2 weeks, something about how the day had gone. A certain weight to them when something had gone wrong out in the pastures that was different from the regular tiredness of a long day done. She hadn't told him she'd learned to read his footsteps. That felt like information he didn't need to have. What she had told him at the end of the second week was that the north pasture fence was going to fail at the 3rd post from the creek bend. He'd stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her with that flat, measuring look. "How do you know that?" "I walked the fence line." "When?" "Tuesday afternoon. Took the children with me. Thomas wanted to see the creek." A pause. "That's a long walk." 3 miles. "Yes." Something moved across his face that wasn't quite irritation and wasn't quite respect, and was probably some uncomfortable mixture of both. "I was going to check that fence next week," he said. "The post won't wait until next week," she said. "The freeze is going to push it the rest of the way over." He checked the fence the next morning. When he came in for supper that night, he didn't say she'd been right, but he told Holt and Cade Mercer to fix the post first thing, and the way he didn't look at Elena while he said it was its own kind of acknowledgement. It was Dutch who laughed. "Walk the fence line," he said to nobody in particular, shaking his head like this was the funniest and best thing he'd heard all week. "Eat your supper, Dutch," Garrick said. Dutch ate his supper, still smiling. The ranch hands had shifted around her in gradations she could track if she paid attention, which she always did. Holt had moved from skeptical to something she could only describe as uncertain admiration. He'd caught himself twice holding doors and then looked embarrassed about it, as if good manners toward a woman he'd originally doubted reflected poorly on his prior judgment. The Mercer brothers had softened after the biscuits. Not her best biscuits, because she'd been working with Calloway's flour stores and his habits, and didn't want to upset the arrangement, but good enough that Sam Mercer had eaten 4 and then looked at her like he was reconsidering some things. Darby remained quiet, but had started sitting closer to her end of the table. Pete Calloway had, one afternoon, shown her where he kept the extra salt without being asked. Garrick remained the hardest to read. He was present at every meal, present at the edges of every domestic decision, but he was careful in a way that felt habitual, as if he'd learned to keep a certain amount of distance between himself and things that might require feeling something. She didn't push into that space. She had enough to manage without navigating whatever was behind those careful walls. What she focused on instead was the work, and the work was considerable. Beyond the cooking and the kitchen, she'd quietly taken on the household repairs that had accumulated over 6 years of a house running without a woman in it. Not dramatic repairs, nothing structural, but the particular kind of domestic decay that men tend not to notice until it becomes a serious problem. She resoldered a leaking pipe fitting under the kitchen sink before it could rot the floorboards. She found the source of the draft in the main hall, which turned out to be a gap in the window casing that someone had tried to fix with a rag 3 years ago, and fixed it properly with spare caulk from the tool shed. She reorganized the pantry according to a system that made sense, which meant Calloway spent 2 days being annoyed because he couldn't find anything, and then 2 more days being secretly relieved because everything was exactly where it should logically be. None of this was heroic. She knew that. It was just maintenance, the daily practice of keeping things from falling apart, which was its own kind of unglamorous courage, and which she understood deeply, because it was what she'd been doing since James died. Just keeping the next thing from falling apart, just making sure the next thing that needed doing got done. She was teaching Thomas his letters one afternoon in the early December quiet, Nora beside them on the floor, arranging small stones into patterns that seemed to have significance only to her, when she heard something wrong from the direction of the bunkhouse. She couldn't have explained exactly what made her put down the primer and go to the window. It wasn't a loud sound. It was almost the opposite. A certain quality of quiet where there shouldn't have been quiet, a gap in the usual mid-afternoon movement of the ranch. She looked out and saw Holt crossing the yard at a walk that was too fast to be casual and too controlled to be a run, heading for the main house. He knocked on the kitchen door, and she was already there when he opened it. "Cade's sick," he said. "Real sick. High fever, puking since this morning. Sam says he was fine yesterday." Elena was already thinking through what she'd seen that morning. Cade at breakfast, not eating much, rubbing at his neck. She'd noticed but filed it under, "Might be a cold, watch it." Clearly, she should have pushed harder. "How high's the fever?" she asked. "I don't know. Hot." His face is... Holt made a gesture that communicated alarming color without vocabulary for it. "Calloway's got willow bark, but Cade won't take it." "Where's Mr. Rowan?" "East pasture. Won't be back until dark." Elena looked at her children. Thomas was watching her with those serious brown eyes. Nora had stopped arranging her stones. "Thomas, stay with your sister," she said. "Do not leave this room." "What's wrong?" Thomas asked. "I'm going to go check on Mr. Mercer. You stay here." She got her mother's tin box from the bedroom and went to the bunkhouse. Cade Mercer was 26 years old and looked, at that moment, about 12, flushed and sweating and trying to hold himself together with the specific miserable stubbornness of a young man who doesn't want anyone to see him sick. He was on his bunk with 3 blankets piled on him and still shaking, which was not a good sign. Elena put her hand on his forehead and kept it there for a count of 10. Too hot. Much too hot. "How long have you had the chills?" she asked. "I'm not cold," Cade said, which was obviously a lie. "How long?" He grimaced. "Since last night. I thought it'd pass." "Is your throat sore?" "Some." "Neck stiff?" He moved his head and winced. "Yeah." She pressed 2 fingers gently along the side of his jaw, and he hissed, swollen glands. She looked at Sam, who was sitting on the adjacent bunk watching her with an expression that was trying to be skeptical but was actually scared because it was his brother. "Has anyone else been feeling poorly?" she asked. Sam and Holt exchanged a look. "Dutch said his head hurt this morning," Holt said slowly. "I thought—" Elena was already moving toward the door. "Go check Dutch," she said. "Right now. And tell me who else has been in close quarters with Cade in the last 4 days." By the time Garrick's horse came into the yard at dusk, Elena had diagnosed 3 men. Cade was the worst. The fever was serious enough that she'd sent Holt for more blankets and started a preparation from her mother's tin, a willow and elderflower combination that her mother had used for exactly this kind of fast-moving fever. Dutch had the same fever at an earlier stage, which was easier to manage. The third was Darby, who had said nothing all day because Darby never said anything and had simply sat through the afternoon in the bunkhouse feeling terrible without mentioning it to anyone. Garrett came in through the kitchen door and stopped. Elena was at the stove with 2 pots going and her sleeves rolled to her elbows and her hair coming loose from its pins. The kitchen smelled like willow bark and something else, some green herbal smell that was sharp and clean. He looked at the pots. He looked at her. "What happened?" he said, and his voice had a different quality in it than usual. Not alarmed exactly, but alert in a way she hadn't heard before. "Fever outbreak," she said. She didn't stop moving. "Cade, Dutch, and Darby. Cade's the most serious. I need you to tell me honestly, is there a doctor within a day's ride?" "Nearest doctor is Ridgeline. That's 2 days in good weather." He paused. "Weather's not good." She'd expected something like that. "Then we manage it here." She looked at him directly. "I know what I'm doing. My mother was the closest thing our county had to a doctor for 20 years. I've treated fevers, infections, respiratory illness. I won't pretend I'm a physician, but I'm not going in blind." He was quiet for 2 seconds. Then, "What do you need?" It was such a simple response, and so different from the dozen other responses he could have had, that she felt something shift slightly in her chest. Some small piece of tension she'd been carrying without naming it. "I need someone to sit with Cade through the night," she said. "He needs the medicine every 2 hours, and the fever needs to be watched. I can't do that and keep the household running." "I'll do it," Garrick said. "You haven't slept." "I'll do it," he said again. No argument, no negotiation. "What else?" "I need Holt to get more water from the well and keep it coming. I need the bunkhouse fire kept up, but not too hot. The room needs to be warm, not stifling, and I need Sam to stay out of my way." Garrick almost smiled. "Sam's scared," he said. "I know he's scared. That's why I need him out of my way. Scared men make bad patients and worse nurses." He nodded. He pulled off his coat and hung it on the peg by the door like a man who had made a decision and was done making it. "I'll talk to Sam." The next 3 days were some of the hardest Elena had experienced in a life that had already had some very hard days. The fever moved through the bunkhouse with the particular malice of winter illness, which doesn't respect effort or intention or how much sleep you haven't gotten. Holt came down with it on the 2nd day. Elena saw it in his eyes at breakfast, that particular glazed quality, and had him in his bunk before noon. Sam held out until the 3rd day and then collapsed entirely, which almost came as a relief because at least it meant he'd stopped hovering at the bunkhouse door asking questions she didn't have time to answer. That left Garrick, Elena, and on the functional edges, Thomas. Her son, 8 years old, James's jaw and James's eyes, and apparently James's absolute refusal to be excluded from something important, had come to her on the 2nd morning with his coat on and his boots tied and said, "Tell me what to do." She'd looked at him for a long moment, this small, serious person. "Water," she said. "Keep the pots filled. Don't go near the sick men. Just knock on the bunkhouse door and leave the bucket." "Can you do that?" "Yes," he said. He did it, without complaint, without drama, just back and forth between the well and the bunkhouse for 2 days, knocking, leaving the bucket, going back. Nora followed him sometimes, sitting on the porch step wrapped in her coat while he worked, watching him with those careful eyes. Elena didn't sleep more than 2 hours at a stretch for 3 days. She moved between the main house and the bunkhouse on a rotation she'd worked out. Check Cade, adjust the medicine, check Dutch, check Holt, back to the kitchen to make broth that would actually stay down. Check Darby, check Cade again. Garrett kept pace with her in the bunkhouse through the nights, doing exactly what she told him to do, which she understood was not nothing for a man who was accustomed to being the one giving directions. He sat with Cade through the worst night without complaint. He changed cold compresses, adjusted blankets, held a cup of medicine to a man's lips at 2 in the morning with the same practical focus he brought to fence posts and cattle counts. "You should sleep," he said to her at 3 a.m. on the 2nd night. She'd come in to check Cade's fever and found Garrick awake, sitting in the chair by the bunk, looking like a man who had been sitting in that chair for a long time. "So should you," she said. "I'm not the one running everything." "Neither are you just sitting there, so stop arguing." She pressed her hand to Cade's forehead. The fever had broken a little. Not gone, but retreated enough that she let out a breath she hadn't known she'd been holding. "He's coming down," she said quietly. She heard Garrick exhale. Just a slow breath, but there was something in it. "My wife," he said, and then stopped. Elena waited. She'd learned that Garrick Rowan said things in his own time, or not at all, and either outcome was equally possible. "Catherine," he said. "She was sick for a long time, 2 years. The kind of sick that doesn't get better." He was looking at Cade's bunk, not at Elena. "The doctor rode out from Ridgeline 6 times. 7. I lost count. Toward the end, he wasn't coming for any reason except to tell me how much further along it was." He was quiet for a moment. "I used to sit in a chair like this." Elena looked at him. He was still looking at the bunk, his forearms on his knees, his hands loose. "She built the garden," Elena said. "Not a question." "Every spring," he said. "Even that last year when she could barely—" He stopped, worked his jaw once. "She wanted tomatoes. Said there was no reason a frontier ranch couldn't grow a decent tomato." "She was right," Elena said. "That soil is excellent." Something crossed his face that was complicated and quiet and entirely his own. "Yeah," he said, "she was." Elena didn't say anything else. There was nothing to say that wouldn't diminish it. She checked Dutch's forehead, adjusted the window against the draft, noted the level on the medicine she'd need to make more of before morning, and did all of this quietly and without making the moment into something larger than it was. When she left the bunkhouse that night, Garrick held the door for her, and as she passed him, he said very quietly, "You haven't lost anyone." She understood he meant the patients, the sick men. "No," she said. "You're not going to," he said. And it wasn't a question. It was a statement, deliberate, like he'd decided it was true and was saying it out loud to make it official. She looked up at him. He was exhausted and hadn't shaved in 3 days, and the cold had put color in his face. He met her eyes, and there was something in that direct look that was different from the measuring look he'd had that first day. Something that had room in it. "No," she said again. "I'm not." She was right. By the 4th day, Cade's fever broke cleanly, and he sat up in his bunk and asked for food, which was such a normal and wonderful thing to want that Sam, still pale from his own recovery, laughed out loud and had to leave the bunkhouse to collect himself. Dutch was up on the 5th day, moving slower than usual with his crutch, but sitting at the supper table and eating with genuine appetite. Holt recovered fastest, the way young men do, and was back at work by day 6 with only a slight persistent cough that Elena dosed with honey and thyme. Darby's was the one that had scared her most. In the quiet way the quiet ones always scared her. He'd spiked again on the 3rd day, higher than she'd expected, and she'd sat up with him through that whole night doing things she'd watched her mother do and trying not to think about what happened if those things didn't work. But they worked. They worked because her mother had known what she was doing and had spent 30 years making sure Elena knew it too. And that knowledge didn't disappear just because James was gone and the ground had shifted under everything. The night Darby's fever finally came down and he slept. Real sleep, not the restless, sick sleep. Elena sat outside the bunkhouse on an overturned bucket for 10 minutes. It was cold. It was completely dark except for the stars, which were extraordinary out here. Nothing between you and them for 100 miles in every direction. Her hands were shaking slightly, which they always did when the pressure was off and the body remembered it was tired. She sat there until the shaking stopped. Then she went inside and made breakfast. 2 days after that, Pete Calloway came to find her in the garden. She'd been out there in the December cold, looking at the beds, measuring in her head what she'd need for spring, making notes in the small book she carried for exactly this kind of thinking. She'd heard him coming from 15 feet away, that deliberate tread on the frozen ground. He stopped at the edge of the garden and put his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the beds and then at her. "I owe you a thing," he said. "You don't," she said. "Dutch," he said. "Dutch and me go back 20 years. If you hadn't caught it when you did." He stopped and worked his jaw, which she recognized as the Calloway version of visible emotion. He might have been in bad shape. "He might have," she agreed. "He's not." Calloway nodded. He looked at the beds again. "You gonna plant these in spring?" "I'd like to." "Catherine always got tomatoes going by May." He said it like he was telling himself, not her. "I can tell you where she kept the seed stock. If it's still good, I don't know. It's been 6 years." Elena looked at him. This was not a small thing from Pete Calloway. She knew that. "I'd appreciate that," she said. He nodded. He started to turn, then stopped. "You're a decent cook," he said, with the air of a man paying a compliment by an act of sheer will against his nature. "The biscuits especially." She kept her face straight. "Thank you, Pete." He walked back toward the house. After 3 paces, he said without turning around, "Don't tell anyone I said that." "I won't," she said. She listened to his boots on the frozen ground until they faded, and then she looked back at the dead garden and thought about what would grow here in the spring. Tomatoes, yes. Catherine's seed stock if it had survived, her own if it hadn't, and everything else a household needed. What could survive the altitude and the short season? What could be preserved to see them through the next winter and the winter after? She was standing there making plans in a dead garden in December, which was an absurd thing to be doing, and she knew it, but she did it anyway. That evening at supper, the table was almost full again for the first time in a week. Cade was up, still thin in the face and careful with his movements, but present. Dutch was beside him, telling a story about a cattle drive from 12 years ago that Elena was fairly certain grew in both scale and drama every time he told it. Holt ate 3 helpings and looked embarrassed about it. The Mercer brothers argued about something involving a card game and an unpaid debt of 50 cents. Garrick sat at the head of the table and looked, for the first time since Elena had arrived, like something in him had eased very slightly. He caught her looking at him from across the table. She looked away. When she looked back, he was still watching her, and this time he didn't look away either, and the moment lasted just long enough to register before Darby dropped his spoon and broke it. Sam was the last one to say anything direct. He came to her the next morning while she was at the kitchen window watching Thomas try to convince Darby's horse that it should let him pet it. She heard him come in and turned, and Sam Mercer, 28 years old and taller than his brother by an inch, stood in the kitchen doorway holding his hat in both hands. "I need to say something," he said. "All right," she said. "I thought—" He looked at his hat. "When you first got here, I thought you weren't going to last. I thought you were going to be trouble, more work for everyone, and then you'd leave." "I know," Elena said. He looked up, surprised. "I could tell," she said. "It's fine. You weren't the only one." "Well?" He put his hat back on, which seemed to help him. "I was wrong about that." "You were," she said, not unkindly. He almost smiled. "Cade says you're the best doctor he's ever seen." "The only doctor he's ever seen, this far out," she said. "The bar isn't that high." "Maybe," Sam said, "but you cleared it." He went out. Through the window, she watched him cross the yard to the corral, where Darby was showing Thomas the correct way to approach a horse, slowly, from the side, letting the animal know you were coming. Her son stood still and reached out his hand, and the horse bent its big head and breathed on his palm. She stayed at that window a moment longer. The cold was still there. The wind was still there. The endless flat enormity of the frontier was still there. But something inside the walls of Cold River Ranch had changed, quietly, without ceremony, in the way that real things change, not all at once, but one person at a time, one small piece of trust at a time, built out of the only materials that actually held, showing up, doing the work, and refusing to stop when it got hard. Elena turned from the window and went to start the afternoon bread. The bread was still warm on the table the morning the sky turned the wrong color. Elena noticed it first because she was always up before everyone else, and because she had learned in 2 months at Cold River Ranch to read the sky the way her mother had taught her to read a patient. Not just what it looked like on the surface, but what it was telling you underneath. The color that morning was a particular shade of yellow-gray that sat low on the horizon and didn't move the way normal clouds moved. It sat there like something with weight and intention. She was standing on the porch with her coffee when Garrick came out behind her, still pulling on his coat. He stopped when he saw her looking north and looked north himself, and she heard him go very quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet. "How bad?" she asked. He was silent for 3 seconds. "Bad," he said. By noon, the wind had picked up. By mid-afternoon, the temperature had dropped enough that Elena pulled the children inside and kept them there and started doing things she'd been doing since Ohio. Inventorying, calculating, thinking 3 steps ahead. She went through the pantry with a methodical focus that she kept from her face, because Thomas was watching her, and he was 8 and smart, and she didn't want him to see her counting cans with the particular expression of someone who is counting and not liking the numbers. The storm hit Cold River Ranch at 9 o'clock that night. It didn't announce itself. One minute there was wind, the kind of wind the frontier always had, and then there was something else entirely. A sound like the world tearing at its seams, a pressure drop that made the lamp flames lean sideways. And then the snow came sideways and white and absolute, and the temperature outside went from cold to a thing that had no comfortable word for it. Elena had both children in the main house bedroom by the time the full weight of the blizzard arrived. She'd already moved the extra firewood inside, 4 armloads, piling it by the main hearth against the wall where it would stay dry. She'd already filled every available container with water from the well, because she'd heard enough about Plains winters to know that pumps froze and you wanted water you could reach. She'd already done the bread and moved the perishable stores to the cold room off the kitchen and laid out the extra blankets. None of which meant she wasn't afraid. She just did the fear quietly, which was the only way she knew how to do it. Through the walls she could hear the ranch hands in the bunkhouse moving around, the low thunder of voices she couldn't make out words from. Garrick had gone to the barn an hour before the storm hit to get the horses in and hadn't come back yet, which she was trying not to think about directly. She was trying not to think about it when the kitchen door opened and he came in on a wall of cold air and wind that slapped the lamp flames flat before he got the door closed. He looked like he'd been in a fight. Snow packed into every crease of his coat, his hat nearly white, his face raw from the wind. He was breathing hard. "Horses are in," he said. "Lost 4 cattle at the north end, couldn't get to them in time. Are you hurt?" He looked at her like the question surprised him. "No." "Sit down anyway." He didn't sit, but he stopped moving, which was close enough. He pulled off his coat, and she took it from him without asking and hung it close to the fire where it would dry. She poured coffee and put it in his hands, and he wrapped both palms around the cup and for a moment just stood there, letting the warmth work into him. "How long does this last?" she asked. "Storm like this?" He looked at the window, which was showing nothing but white and dark and the sound of something trying to get in. 2 days. Could be 3. She did the arithmetic in her head while she looked at the pantry door. "I need to talk to you about the food stores." He looked at her. "We have enough," she said, "but not comfortably enough. Not for 9 people over 3 days if the cold keeps up the way it's going, because people eat more in cold like this. It's not a crisis yet, but it will be if we don't manage it carefully from the start." Garrick set down his cup. He had a way of receiving information. He didn't argue with it or qualify it or make it smaller than it was. He just took it in and thought about it. "Tell me what you need." "I need the men to know we're rationing without calling it rationing," she said. "If you tell a hungry man he's being rationed, he spends all his time thinking about how hungry he is. If you just feed him meals that are hearty but smaller than usual, he adjusts without the resentment." He was quiet for a moment. "You've done this before." "My father's farm had a bad year when I was 12, she said, "and another when I was 17. My mother rationed us through both of them, and we didn't figure it out until the second spring." Something moved across his face. "All right," he said. "Handle it however you need to." It was, she thought, the most open-ended grant of authority anyone had ever given her, and it came without conditions or qualifications, and she understood what it cost a man like Garrick Rowan to hand over that particular piece of ground. "Go get dry," she said. "I have supper almost ready." He picked up his coat from where she'd hung it, still damp, but better, and looked at her for a moment with that direct look she'd stopped being surprised by. Then he went down the hall. The first full day of the blizzard was manageable. Elena ran the kitchen on what she thought of as wartime logic. Every ingredient worked to its maximum potential. Nothing wasted. Everything stretched. The breakfast was cornmeal porridge with dried apples stirred through it, which was filling and warm and tasted better than it sounded. And she made enough that the men could have 2 helpings if they needed them. Lunch was a thick soup built from smoked ham bones and root vegetables and dried beans that had been soaking since the night before. Supper was elk stew she'd been making last, with cornbread that used a little less flour than her usual recipe and a little more water, which nobody noticed. Pete Calloway noticed. He came to find her in the kitchen after supper when the men had gone back to the bunkhouse and the children were asleep and the storm outside was doing something to the north wall that sounded structural but probably wasn't. "You're stretching the stores," he said, not accusing, just stating. "Yes," she said. He pulled out the chair at the kitchen table and sat down heavily. He looked tired, not the regular tired of a hard day, but the deeper tired of a man who was worrying about things he couldn't fix. How long can we go? 4 days at this rate, she said. Maybe 5 if I'm creative on day 3. And if the storm goes longer than 3 days? She looked at him directly because he deserved a direct answer. Then it gets harder. He rubbed his face with one hand. I've been through 3 winters on this ranch, he said. Lost a man once. Not to weather, to a stupid accident, a horse he should have known better than to trust. But I've never... He stopped. The men are restless. Darby's fine, Dutch is fine. But the Mercer boys get loud when they're penned up, and Holt's got that cough still from the fever, and I don't like the sound of it. I know about Holt's cough, Elena said. She'd been listening to it through the wall of the main house. I have something for it. I'll give it to him tomorrow. Calloway looked at her for a long moment in the lamplight. His squint had softened into something that was just his face, unguarded. I owe you another thing, he said. I keep owing you things. You don't owe me anything, Pete. I do, he said, with quiet stubbornness. I was wrong about you too, just like Sam was. The difference is, I've been wrong about people before, and I should know better by now. Elena sat down across from him. Outside, the storm found a gap somewhere and moaned through it. You were protecting something, she said. This place, the way things worked. New person shows up, upsets the balance. That's reasonable. Maybe, he said. Doesn't make it right. She didn't argue with him. He'd needed to say it, and she'd let him say it, and now it was said. She poured him coffee from the pot she'd kept on the back of the stove, and he took it with both hands the same way Garrick had the night before, and she thought about how cold does that to people. Strips the formality away, reduces everyone to the same basic animal need for warmth and something hot to hold. The second day was harder. The storm didn't ease. If anything, it deepened. The snow accumulation outside the windows was past the bottom sill by morning, and the wind had a constant register now, not gusting but sustained, which was in some ways worse than gusting because there was no break in it. No moment where you could catch your breath and think, it's letting up. It just went on and on with the flat endurance of something that didn't need to stop. Holt's cough was worse. Elena dosed him with the preparation she'd described to Calloway, a combination of dried thyme, honey, and something her mother had called the breathing herb, which she'd never learned the formal name of, only what it did, which was open the chest and ease the spasm. Holt took it without argument, which told her he felt worse than he was letting on. Thomas came to find her mid-morning while she was in the cold room reorganizing the remaining stores. Mama, he said, Mr. Mercer, the loud one, said we're going to run out of food. She turned around. Her son was standing in the doorway with his coat half on, his face carrying that particular expression of a child who has heard something alarming and is desperately hoping an adult will tell him it's wrong. She made herself speak calmly. Which Mr. Mercer? Sam. She set down the jars she was holding. We are not going to run out of food, she said. Sam is worried, which is understandable, but I am managing the food and I know what we have and we are not going to run out. Thomas searched her face. Children do this. Say, look for the truth underneath the reassurance. Try to find the crack where the real answer is leaking out. She held his gaze and didn't let him find a crack, because there wasn't one. She believed what she was saying. She was going to make it true by the same means she made everything true out here, by working at it until it was. Okay, Thomas said finally. He zipped his coat the rest of the way. Can I go to the bunkhouse? Darby's showing me how to fix a bridle. Boots on the mat when you come back, she said. He went. She turned back to the stores and kept counting. Sam Mercer found her an hour later in the kitchen. He had the decency to look slightly ashamed of himself. I might have said something that worried your boy, he said. You did, Elena said. She was making bread, working the dough with the concentrated focus of someone who is choosing not to be angry. He's 8 years old, Sam. I know. I'm sorry. He leaned against the doorframe. I don't like not being able to do anything. Being stuck in here while Garrick's out in that... Garrick's in the barn, she said. He's not in the storm. He went out an hour ago. Her hand stopped. The North Corral gate failed, Sam said. The wind got under it. He went out to fix it before we lost the remaining cattle. Elena looked at the window. The window showed her nothing useful, just white pressure and dark. The temperature outside was the kind of number that did specific damage to a person in a specific amount of time, and Garrick had been out in it for an hour. She made herself finish the bread shape and put it to rise. She made herself pour coffee and carry it to the table and sit down for 30 seconds, because running to the door and staring out at a blizzard did nothing for anyone. She was on her feet at the door at the 40-minute mark. She didn't go outside. She wasn't foolish enough to go outside in a blizzard alone. But she opened the door and the cold hit her like a physical thing, and she called his name into the white once, twice, and on the third time heard something, a shape in the wind that might have been a voice. Then she saw him. A dark shape in all that white, moving toward the house at a walk that was too deliberate, the walk of a man who is concentrating on staying upright. She grabbed the rope they'd tied from the porch post to the bunkhouse for exactly this purpose, orientation, so you could always find your way back, and went down the porch steps into the snow, which came up past her knees and was cold enough to feel like burning. She got to him in 6 steps. He was breathing hard through his nose, his face past red and into something paler, which was not a good color. She grabbed his arm. "I've got you. Gate's fixed," he said. He sounded like a man who wanted to communicate the important information first. "Good," she said. "Walk." She got him back up the steps and through the door, and the warmth hit them both at once. She kept moving. Got him to the kitchen, got his coat off, got him into the chair closest to the stove. His hands, when she took them, were the wrong temperature. She knew exactly what to do about that. Her mother had taught her that too. "Don't rub them," she said, when his instinct was to rub his own hands together. "Just hold still." She wrapped his hands in the dry towel she kept by the stove and held them between her own palms, which were warm from the kitchen work, and she kept steady pressure on them and felt, over the next few minutes, the heat beginning to come back. He was looking at her while she did this. She was looking at his hands, monitoring. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. "You came out," he said. "You were late." "I had it handled." "You did," she agreed. "But you were late, and I came out." She looked up at him. "Next time, take the rope from the porch." He held her gaze. His color was coming back with the dangerous pale retreating, the wind-raw red returning, which was a much better situation. "Next time," he said, "you don't come out in a blizzard." "Next time you don't either. I had to fix the gate." "I know." "The cattle?" "I know, Garrick." She said his name without thinking about it, and it landed in the space between them, and neither of them said anything for a moment. His hands were warmer. She could feel it. She let them go. She moved to the stove and poured coffee and gave it to him, and started talking about supper. What she was making, what she'd decided to do with the last of the salt pork. And he listened and answered, and by the time she had the pot on the flame, the moment had been folded away into the ordinary flow of things. But it hadn't disappeared. The third day was when it really became a fight. The storm had outlasted its predicted 2 days and showed no sign of stopping, and that changed the arithmetic in ways Elena had been hoping to avoid. By the morning of the third day, she was making meals from combinations that required creativity and stubbornness in equal measure. Dried corn cooked down into a thick cake that was more filling than it looked. A potato soup stretched with water but fortified with whatever dried herbs had the most warmth in them. Small portions served in large bowls to create the illusion of abundance. But it was the cold that was winning the real battle. Not everyone's cold. The children were fine. Elena made sure of that with a ferocity she didn't bother to hide, keeping their room the warmest in the house, making sure they ate first and ate enough. But the bunkhouse fire had a problem on the third day. A blockage in the chimney from snow accumulation on the roof, which reduced the draft and made the fire work poorly. And 6 men in a cold bunkhouse in a 3-day blizzard was not just uncomfortable, it was medically problematic. Darby was the one who found the blockage. He reported it to Elena, not to Garrick, who was dealing with a structural concern about the barn roof, but to Elena, which she noted without commenting on, and Elena went to look at it herself and came back and made a decision. "Everyone in the main house," she said. Calloway stared at her. "That's 9 people in." "8 people in the main house and 2 children," she said. "The bunkhouse chimney isn't safe, and the room will drop below what's acceptable within a few hours. The main house hearth is working, and the kitchen stove is working, and we move everyone in until someone can clear the chimney. Garrick, I'll tell Garrick, she said. Start moving the bedrolls. Garrick, when she told him, looked at her for exactly 2 seconds and said, do it. Which was how she'd expected him to respond, because she'd learned that about him too. When the logic was clear, he didn't waste time arguing with the logic. 9 adults and 2 children in a house built for one man was its own particular kind of chaos. The Mercer brothers argued about who slept closer to the hearth until Dutch told them both, with a specific profanity she hadn't heard him use before, to stop it. Darby arranged himself in a corner with his bedroll and his natural quiet, and seemed actually to prefer the indoor situation. Holt was coughing less. The medicine had been working, and the warmth helped. Calloway commandeered a corner of the kitchen with the specific air of a man defending territory, which Elena allowed because it kept him occupied. Nora, in the middle of all this noise and crowding and displaced men arranging bedrolls on her floor, did something unexpected. She walked up to Dutch Harlan, who was sitting against the wall with his bad leg extended, and she looked at him for a long moment with those grave, dark eyes. Then she climbed up and sat down beside him, close enough that her shoulder pressed against his arm. Dutch looked down at her with an expression of profound surprise, and then of something much softer. "Well?" he said, to nobody in particular. "Hello there." Nora said nothing. She just leaned against his arm and watched the room, and Dutch sat very still, like a man who has been given something fragile and doesn't want to drop it. Elena saw this from across the room and had to look away before her face did something she didn't want anyone to see. The third night was the hardest night. It wasn't any single thing. It was the accumulation. The wind at a pitch that made sleep difficult. The cold radiating through walls that were good walls but not infinite walls. The children's thin faces in the lamplight, and the knowledge, sitting always at the back of her mind, that she was calculating against a dwindling column of numbers, and the storm had not decided to be reasonable. She was awake at 2 a.m, sitting by the kitchen stove, with her knees pulled to her chest and her mother's tin box open in her lap. Not because she needed anything from it, but because having it out was its own kind of comfort. The smell of the herbs her mother had dried and labeled in that small, careful handwriting that Elena could still see exactly, when she heard Garrick. He sat down across from her at the kitchen table. He'd been sleeping on the floor with the hands. His own bedroom given to Elena and the children without discussion or announcement, simply done. And he looked like a man who had not been sleeping well. He looked at the tin box. "Your mother's?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "She teach you everything you know about medicine?" "Everything practical," Elena said. She said the difference between a real healer and someone who just knows herbs is knowing when the herbs aren't enough. Knowing when to say, "I can't fix this, go find someone else." "Have you ever had to say that?" She thought about it honestly. "Twice," she said. "Once was a man with a broken bone that had set wrong. Once was a woman in labor with a baby turned wrong. Both times I was able to get someone there who could do what I couldn't." "And out here," he said, "when there's nobody else to get?" She looked at him across the table. The lamp between them was burning low. "Then you do everything you can," she said, "and you live with whatever the result is." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. She'd noticed he did this when he was thinking through something. "I should have married someone tougher for out here," he said. Not bitterly, just the flat, factual tone he used for things he'd thought through many times. Catherine was extraordinary, but the winters were hard on her, even before she got sick. He looked at the window, which was still showing nothing but dark and white. "I used to think about that, whether it would have been different somewhere easier." "Would you have gone somewhere easier?" she asked. He shook his head immediately, no hesitation. "Then it doesn't help to think about it," she said. He looked at her. Something crossed his face that was complicated and slow-moving, like weather. "No," he said. "I guess it doesn't." The fourth morning, the storm broke. Not gradually, not with a warning. The way it had come was the way it left. All at once. Elena woke to a silence so complete after 3 days of constant wind that the absence of sound was itself loud. She lay still for a moment, listening to nothing. Then she got up and went to the window, and the world outside was white and still and blue-shadowed with early light, and the sky above it was the cleanest, hardest blue she had ever seen. She stood there with her hand against the cold glass. Behind her, she heard Nora stir, and then heard, and this was a sound that stopped Elena's heart for a full second before she understood what it was. Heard her daughter say, in a voice rusty from disuse, small and uncertain, but entirely present, "Mama, is the snow done?" Elena turned around. Nora was sitting up in the bed with the blanket around her shoulders and her dark eyes wide and serious and looking directly at her mother. And she had spoken. She had said words out loud. She had opened that door. Elena crossed the room in 3 steps and sat on the bed and pulled her daughter against her chest and held her, just held her, with her face pressed into Nora's hair. And she didn't make a sound because there were no sounds adequate to what was happening in her chest. Nora let herself be held for a moment, then pulled back and looked at Elena with a slightly impatient expression, the face of a 5-year-old who has just said something reasonable and is waiting for an answer. "Is the snow done?" she said again. Elena pulled in one breath, then another. "Yes," she said, her voice steady, or close enough. "The snow is done." She heard Thomas wake up behind her and sit up, and heard him go very still in the particular way he'd gone still whenever he was afraid to hope for something. She felt him realize what had happened before she turned around, heard it in the way his breathing changed. She kept her arm around Nora and reached the other arm out for her son, and he came and leaned against her, and the 3 of them sat like that on the narrow bed with the cold morning light coming through the window and the silence of a world after a storm all around them. It wasn't a moment she could have planned or manufactured. It came on its own schedule, the way most of the real things did between the hard work and the hard nights, somewhere in the space she'd kept open by refusing to give up the things she was refusing to give up. Outside, she could already hear boots on the porch, Garrick's tread, moving with that quality she'd learned to read. Not the heaviness of a hard day, but something purposeful, awake. The ranch was still standing. The morning fire needed starting, and there were 9 hungry people and 2 children to feed, and the snow would need clearing before the livestock could be properly managed, and the chimney in the bunkhouse still needed fixing, and the stores she'd stretched through 3 brutal days would need rebuilding before the next storm came, because out here there was always a next storm. She kissed the top of Nora's head. She kissed Thomas on the forehead, which he tolerated with the dignified suffering of an 8-year-old. Then she got up, pulled on her dress and her boots and her apron, and went to start the fire. The bunkhouse chimney got fixed on the first clear day. Holt and Cade up on the roof with shovels while the rest of the crew worked the yard below, moving snow with the focused energy of men who had been penned up for 4 days and needed something physical to do with it. The sound of it, boots on packed snow, the scrape of shovels, the Mercer brothers arguing about the most efficient clearing pattern, was the best sound Elena had heard in a week. Ordinary noise, the noise of a working ranch getting back to itself. She watched it from the kitchen window while she put together the first real breakfast she'd been able to make since the storm started. Real biscuits, full measure of flour, the good kind with butter worked in. Bacon from the last of the salt pork she'd been saving. Eggs from the 3 hens that had survived the cold in the small coop Garrick had insulated the autumn before. She made enough for everyone and then a little more. Because people who have been rationed for 4 days need the first full meal to feel like abundance, even if it isn't technically abundance yet. Nora sat at the kitchen table while Elena worked, which was where Nora had taken to sitting in the mornings now. Close enough to be near her mother, far enough to have her own space, which was exactly the geometry of a child who was feeling her way back to something. She hadn't said much since that first morning, just the occasional word or short phrase, but that was fine. Elena wasn't pushing. The door was open. What came through it would come in its own time. Thomas had gone outside approximately 3 minutes after being allowed to, and was currently somewhere in the vicinity of the barn, making himself useful in ways she was choosing not to supervise too closely, because he was 8 and capable and needed to do things without her watching. She was pulling the biscuits from the oven when Garrick came in. He came in the way he always did when something had been decided, directly, without the slight hesitation he had when he was still working something through. He sat down at the kitchen table across from Nora, who looked at him with her careful eyes, and he looked back at her with the same steady attention he gave everything. And after a moment, Nora pushed her small pile of pebbles across the table toward him. She'd been arranging them while Elena cooked, a habit she'd developed over the winter, organizing and reorganizing the same collection of smooth creek stones she'd been carrying since Ohio. Garrick looked at the pebbles. He picked one up, turned it in his fingers, set it back down. Thank you, he said to Nora, as if she'd offered him something valuable, which Elena understood she had. Nora pulled the pebbles back and went back to arranging them. Garrick looked at Elena. I need to talk to you, he said, when you have a minute. The biscuits need 5 minutes to cool, she said. Sit. He sat. She poured coffee and gave him a cup and poured one for herself and sat down at the other end of the table. And Nora moved her pebbles between them like she was conducting negotiations. He turned his cup in his hands. She'd seen him do this enough times now that she recognized it as the particular thing he did before saying something that cost him something. I've been thinking, he said. He stopped. About the ranch? She asked, to give him a foothold. About the ranch, he'd said. And about... He stopped again. He looked at Nora, who was not paying attention to either of them, or appeared not to be. About how this winter would have gone without you. Elena kept her face neutral and waited. Cade's alive, Garrick said. Dutch is alive. Darby pulled through something that I don't think would have pulled through without someone who knew what they were doing. The food lasted because you made it last. The men held together because you held them together. He paused. I managed a barn and a gate and a lot of cold. You managed everything else. You managed considerably more than a barn and a gate, she said. Elena. He said her name the same way she'd said his that night in the kitchen. Without planning it, just the name, direct. It stopped her. I'm trying to say something, and I'd appreciate it if you let me finish saying it. She made herself be quiet. He looked at his cup. When I wrote you that letter, he said, I wrote it because I owed James something. He was a good man who worked hard for me and died before anything went right for him, and his wife and children had nowhere to go and I had a roof. It was a practical decision. I know that, she said. I know you know that. He looked up. What I'm trying to say is that it stopped being that about 3 weeks in. Maybe sooner. He set the cup down. You walked my fence line. You fixed my pipe under the sink. You cleaned my kitchen the first night without anyone asking you to. You treated my men like they mattered, and you made my house into something that... He stopped, worked his jaw once. Something that feels like a place people live, instead of a place people wait out the winter. From outside came the sound of the Mercer brothers finishing their argument about the snow clearing, which meant they'd agreed on something, which was either a miracle or a sign that Cade had threatened physical consequences. The sound of boots on the cleared porch boards, the ordinary world going on. I don't know how to do this, Garrick said. I want to be clear about that. I'm not a man who... He looked at Nora again briefly, then back at Elena. I closed a lot of things down when Catherine died. I'm aware of that. The men are aware of it. It's been 6 years and I'm aware that some of what I am now is not entirely... He stopped, visibly frustrated with himself and with the inadequacy of the words. I'm not easy to live with. I've noticed, Elena said. He looked at her. There was something in his expression that was almost startled and then almost amused, and it moved through his face quickly, but she caught it. I'm not asking for anything you're not willing to give, he said. He said it carefully, like he'd worked on this sentence. I understand what you've been through. I understand you came here out of necessity, and not because... I understand that. He looked at his cup. But I'd like you to stay. Not as the woman who cooks and manages the household, as... He stopped one more time, and this stop was different from the others, quieter, more exposed. As what? She said, and her voice came out quieter than she intended. He looked at her directly. As my family, he said. You and Thomas and Nora, if that's something you could want, eventually. There's no... I'm not asking you to decide anything today. I'm just asking you to know that it's what I want, so you have the full information. Elena looked at him across the kitchen table in the winter morning light, this difficult, precise, guarded man who had opened his roof out of obligation and somewhere along the way had opened something considerably harder to open. She thought about the 11 lines of that letter. She thought about him sitting in the chair by Cade's bunk at 3 a.m. without complaint. She thought about him saying use it about his dead wife's garden and the way that it cost him and the way he'd paid it anyway. She thought about James, which she did every day, which she would do every day for the rest of her life, and which was not a reason to refuse the living. I'm not ready to decide anything today, she said. He nodded immediately, like he'd expected exactly this answer. Okay. But I want you to know, she said, that it's not a no. He was quiet for a moment. Something shifted in his face. Not dramatically, not the way it would shift in a story that was tidying itself up. Just a small, private change, the kind that happens when a person has been braced for something and the something turns out to be slightly less than what they were braced for. All right, he said. He picked up his cup. That's enough. Nora, without looking up from her pebbles, pushed one stone across the table toward Garrick's side. Just one. A smooth gray one, smaller than the others. He looked at it. He picked it up carefully and put it in the breast pocket of his shirt. Elena turned to check the biscuits and did not let either of them see her face for the next 30 seconds. Spring came to Cold River Ranch the way spring always came to the northern plains. Badly, grudgingly, with several false starts and at least 2 more snowfalls that felt like personal insults after everything February had already done. March was cold and wet and produced mud of a depth and persistence that made November's mud seem like a minor inconvenience. The hands moved through the yard in boots that were caked to the knee by midday and left the kitchen floor in a state that required Elena to stop thinking of it as a floor and start thinking of it as a surface that was temporarily hosting soil. She didn't mind. Mud meant thaw. Thaw meant the ground was coming back. She started on Catherine's garden in the second week of March, when the soil in the sheltered south beds had softened enough to turn. She did it in the early mornings before the kitchen work demanded her full attention, working with a short-handled spade while the light was still gray and the rest of the ranch was just beginning to stir. The soil was as good as she'd assessed in December, dark and well-built, with the particular structure of earth that has been loved for years and still remembers it. Thomas helped when he wasn't working with Darby at the corral. He'd developed, over the winter, a genuine competence around horses that Darby had quietly encouraged by the simple method of giving him more responsibility each week without comment. He could now saddle Darby's smaller horse without assistance, which he demonstrated for Elena with the concentrated care of a person who has practiced something many times in private and is only showing it to you when he's sure he won't fail. Nora talked more. Slowly, unevenly, with silences that still stretched longer than they probably should, but the silence had changed its quality. It was a thinking silence now, not a locked one. She'd taken to following Dutch around the yard when the weather allowed, which Dutch bore with visible delight. He'd started teaching her the names of things, the parts of the saddle, the different kinds of grass, the clouds, and what they meant about weather. Nora absorbed this information with the focused seriousness she brought to everything and repeated the words back to him in her small, careful voice, like she was testing how they felt. That girl's going to know more about weather than any of us by summer, Dutch told Elena one evening at supper. Don't tell her that, Elena said. She'll feel obligated to know more. Dutch smiled his gap-toothed smile. Would that be bad? Elena thought about it. No, she said. Probably not. Garrick was at the other end of the table, and she felt him listening without appearing to listen, which she'd become fluent in reading. He had a way of going still when things happened that mattered to him, a subtle shift in his attention that was different from his usual focus. She didn't call attention to it. She'd learned that Garrick Rowan kept certain things better when they weren't named directly, and that was all right. She had her own version of the same instinct. What had changed between them since that morning in the kitchen was quiet and undramatic and real. He found reasons to be in the kitchen in the late evenings more often than he had before. She found herself talking to him about things she'd previously thought through alone. The spring planting plans, the children, the question of whether the cold cellar needed better insulation before next winter. He answered with the same directness he brought to everything, no softening of his opinions to make them easier, which she valued more than she could explain after years of people being careful with her. He was careful with her, but only about the things that deserved care. Everything else he gave to her straight, which was its own kind of respect. One evening in late March, she was in the garden at dusk, turning the last bed, when she heard his boots on the frozen path and didn't look up. You're going to lose the light, he said. 5 more minutes of light, she said. I can see. He crouched down at the edge of the bed, forearms on his knees, in the way he had of getting down to the level of whatever he was looking at. He picked up a handful of the turned soil and held it for a moment and let it fall. She'd be glad this is being used, he said. Elena kept her spade moving. I know. I used to... He stopped, started again. I used to feel like maintaining it was disrespectful to her, like using her things was erasing her somehow. He looked at the soil in his palm. That was wrong. It wasn't wrong, Elena said. It was grief. Grief makes things that aren't true feel like the only true things. He was quiet for a moment. Is that from your mother too? No, she said. That's from me. He looked at her. The evening light was doing something particular to the sky to the west, that deep clear blue that comes after cold, with the last of the sun going orange along the bottom edge of it. It made the garden look, briefly, like something from a different and gentler story. Catherine would have liked you, he said. He said it simply, without maneuvering. Elena looked at him. I'd like to think so. He stood up. Come in when you lose the light, he said, with the tone of a man who knows he's not going to win an argument and is choosing not to have it. 5 minutes, she said. He went back up the path. At the gate he stopped. He didn't turn around. Elena, he said. Yes, the seed stock Calloway showed you, the tomato seeds. There's also, Catherine kept some herbs in the tin beside the seed box. She grew them for cooking, mostly, but she also knew what they were for, the medical kind. He paused. I thought you should know those were there, in case they were useful. She put her spade down. She stood up and looked at his back, at the set of his shoulders, at everything he was not saying. Thank you, she said. He nodded once and went inside. She stood in the darkening garden with her dirty hands and the smell of turned earth and the sky going blue-black above her, and she made no attempt to be practical about the feeling that was in her chest. She just let it be there. She was ready before she knew she was ready. That was the thing about grief. It didn't leave cleanly. It didn't announce when it was done. Just slowly made room. James was still there, in Thomas's face and Nora's dark eyes, and in the particular way she still reached for his memory when she needed steadying. He would always be there, but the space grief had taken up had been changing shape, quietly, over these months, and what was filling the new shape was not a replacement for anything. It was just the next true thing. The proposal, when it finally happened, was almost comically impractical, which was the most appropriate thing about it. It was a Tuesday in April. Elena was fixing the kitchen door hinge, which had been sticking since February and which she'd been meaning to address for 6 weeks. She had the hinge off, and the door propped against the wall, and a screwdriver in her hand, and was lying on the floor, looking at the stripped screw that was the source of the problem, which was going to require a different approach than she'd planned. Garrick walked in, stopped, and looked at her lying on the kitchen floor. The hinge, she said. I can see the hinge, he said. The lower screw is stripped. I need a longer screw and a different anchor. I have both in the tool shed. He didn't move. He was looking at her with something in his expression that she couldn't immediately classify. I'll get them. I know where the tool shed is, she said. I know you do. He crouched down so he was closer to her level. He looked at the hinge, then at her. Stay down there a minute. She looked at him. Why? He sat down fully on the kitchen floor, which was not a thing she had ever seen Garrick Rowan do, and it was so unexpected that she didn't say anything for a moment. He sat cross-legged with his back against the cabinet and looked at her with the expression she finally identified as the one he'd had that morning in December when he'd asked her to be his family. That particular combination of resolved and exposed, that was the hardest version of him and the most real. I've been trying to find the right moment for this, he said. There isn't one. There's never a right moment on a working ranch. Something always needs doing. Garrick, something's always going to need doing, he said. The hinge needed doing, and the fence needed doing, and next week something else will need doing. I've been waiting for a quiet moment, and there aren't quiet moments. So you're on the floor fixing a hinge, and I'm going to say this anyway. She put the screwdriver down. I love you, he said. He said it the way he said everything important, straight, without softening, like a man reading from a document he has checked twice for accuracy. I don't say that lightly, and I don't say it to push you toward anything, but I said in December that I wanted you and the children to be my family, and I meant it then, and I mean it more now, and I'd like you to marry me, if you're willing. He paused. I know this isn't the circumstances anyone would choose for— Yes, she said. He stopped. Yes, she said again, because the first one had been quiet, and she wanted to be sure he'd heard it. He looked at her for a long moment on the kitchen floor, and something moved across his face that she hadn't seen on it before. Something that didn't have a careful name, that wasn't measured or managed, that was just there, plain and ungoverned and entirely his. "Okay," he said. His voice had changed texture, just slightly. "Okay," she said. Neither of them moved for a moment. The kitchen was warm. Outside, she could hear Thomas at the corral. His voice, and then Darby's lower response, and then the sound of a horse moving. From the front of the house came Nora's voice. "Dutch, that's a cumulus," in the precise tone of a child who has been taught something and is deploying it with absolute seriousness. Dutch's laugh, warm and gap-toothed, rolling across the yard. Garrick looked toward the sound of his ranch, his people, and then back at Elena on the floor beside the broken hinge. "I'll get the longer screw," he said. "I'll finish the hinge," she said. He stood up and held out his hand. She took it, and he pulled her to her feet and then let her hand go, and they stood in the kitchen a foot apart, and the distance between them had the particular quality of something just before it closes. She picked up the screwdriver. He went to get the screw. And if his hand had, for just a moment, held hers a beat longer than necessary to get her off the floor, she didn't comment on it, and he didn't comment on it. And some things don't need to be said to be true. The news moved through the ranch with the particular speed of news in a small community where everyone lives on top of each other. She didn't announce it. She told Dutch because Dutch was the one she told things to, and by supper Dutch had somehow conveyed it to every person on the property without apparently saying a direct word to anyone about it, which was a social skill Elena deeply respected. The reactions were what they were. Dutch said nothing at supper, just looked at Elena across the table with his warm, gap-toothed face and raised his coffee cup toward her slightly, which was enough. Pete Calloway came to her in the kitchen after, in the way he always came when he had something to say that he needed to say privately. And he stood with his hands in his pockets and said, "I'm glad." And she said, "Thank you, Pete." And he said, "Catherine's herb tin. She'd want you to have it either way, but especially this way." And then he went to his corner, and that was all. But it was everything Pete Calloway had in him to give, and she knew it. Sam Mercer shook Garrick's hand at the breakfast table the next morning with the direct formality of a man who wants to communicate genuine respect and has the social vocabulary for it. Cade slapped his brother on the shoulder and grinned at Elena like she'd done something he personally approved of, which she supposed she had. Holt said nothing for a full day, which puzzled her, and then came to find her in the garden on the second afternoon and stood at the bed edge with his red hair in the April wind and said, "He's a good man. He doesn't always show it where people can see it, but he's a good man." "I know that," she said. "Okay." He looked at the garden. "You need help turning those back beds? I've got an hour." "Get a spade," she said. He went and got a spade, and they worked the back beds in the afternoon light, and he talked about his family in Kansas, which he'd never mentioned before, and she listened, and the garden that had been Catherine's and was now becoming something else entirely absorbed the work of both their hands. Thomas took it in with the careful seriousness he brought to significant information. He came to Elena that evening and sat beside her on the edge of the bed in the room that had been small and cold in November, and was now, with spring coming, starting to feel like a room a person actually lived in. "Is Garrick going to be my father?" he said. She thought about how to answer this. "He's going to be your stepfather," she said. "Your father was James, and that doesn't change. But Garrick will be part of your family, yes, in a real way. Not just living in the same house." Thomas was quiet for a moment. He had his father's habit of thinking before he spoke, which she had always valued in James and valued equally in this 8-year-old who was so much his son, it sometimes stopped her mid-breath. "Garrick showed me how the cattle count works last week," Thomas said. "He let me help mark the ledger." "Did he?" she said. "He didn't let me make mistakes go by just to be nice," Thomas said. "He made me do it right." She understood, from her son's tone, that this was the highest possible form of respect he could offer another person. "That sounds like him," she said. Thomas leaned against her shoulder briefly, the way he used to when he was younger and had been phasing out over the past year in the interest of being 8 and therefore essentially grown. She put her arm around him and he let her. "Okay," he said, the same single syllable his almost stepfather used to close a decision. She almost laughed. "Okay," she said. Nora told the same news in simpler terms the same evening, had looked at Elena very seriously for a long moment and then said, "Can I keep the gray stone?" Elena had taken her a moment to remember. The stone Nora had given Garrick at the kitchen table in December, the one he'd put in his breast pocket. "That's something you'd have to ask him," she said. The next morning, Nora walked up to Garrick in the yard while he was talking to Sam about the spring cattle count, tugged once on his sleeve, and when he looked down at her, held out her hand. He reached into his pocket and put the gray stone into her palm. She looked at it for a moment, then she put it back in his hand and closed his fingers around it. He looked at the stone in his hand, then he put it back in his pocket. Sam Mercer looked away at the middle distance with an expression like a man who has been punched lightly in the chest. Garrick looked down at Nora, who was already walking back toward the porch where Dutch was sitting with the morning coffee, ready to discuss whatever cloud formations the day was offering. The stone stayed in his pocket from that day forward. Elena watched this from the kitchen window with flour on her hands and the morning bread half made and the sound of Cold River Ranch coming alive around her. Horses in the corral, boots on the boards, Calloway's voice from the cold room, Thomas asking Darby something she couldn't hear, Dutch explaining cirrus clouds to a 5-year-old with appropriate scientific gravity. And she thought about the word home, what it was built from, what materials actually held. Not perfection, not the absence of loss or grief or the memory of hard things, not even happiness, exactly, though happiness was in there somewhere, present and real, and still occasionally surprising her. Just this. Just the daily accumulation of people choosing each other, over and over, in all the ordinary moments that nobody would remember individually, but that added up, over time, to something that lasted. The bread needed finishing. She went back to the dough. They were married on a Saturday in May, which was the first Saturday that didn't have rain in it, and therefore the first Saturday that felt like a reasonable choice. There was no ceremony in any formal sense. The nearest minister was in Ridgeline, 2 days' ride, and Elena had not suggested fetching one and Garrick had not offered to. And somewhere in the mutual absence of that suggestion, they had arrived at an understanding. They would do it their own way, which was the way they had done everything else. Dutch, who turned out to have once held some minor civic position in a previous life he rarely discussed, stood in the yard between the main house and the barn with a worn book of civil proceedings, and read the relevant words in his gap-toothed, weathered voice while the ranch hands stood in a rough semicircle with their hats in their hands. Calloway had made a cake. This was the most startling domestic event Elena had witnessed since arriving at Cold River Ranch, including the blizzard. It was not a beautiful cake. It listed slightly to the left, like the barn, and the icing was more of a suggestion than a commitment. But it was made with the full deliberate effort of a man who has decided to do something he has never done before and refuses to fail at it on the first attempt. When Elena saw it on the kitchen table that morning, she had looked at Pete Calloway for a long moment, and he had looked back at her with his permanent squint and said, "Don't say anything." And she had said, "I wasn't going to say anything." And that had been that. Thomas stood beside Garrick during the ceremony with the posture of a boy who has been told this is an important occasion and is taking that information very seriously. He was wearing his good shirt, which Elena had pressed the night before, and his boots were clean, which he had done himself without being asked, and she had noticed this without commenting on it because commenting on it would have made it smaller. Nora stood beside Elena and held her hand and watched Dutch read the words with the focused attention she gave to Dutch's instructions about weather. When Dutch reached the part where Garrick said what he was going to say, which he said in the same direct, unadorned way he said everything, looking at Elena and not at the book, the words clearly his own and not recited, Nora looked up at Elena to see how she was receiving this information. Whatever she saw on her mother's face seemed to satisfy her. She turned back to Dutch and watched him finish. When it was done, Sam Mercer whooped, which startled everyone, including Sam, and Cade punched him in the shoulder, and Dutch closed his book with a small private smile, and Holt stood with his hat in both hands looking at the ground with the expression of a young man feeling something he doesn't have the vocabulary for yet. Garrick looked at Elena. She looked at him. He was not a man who performed happiness, which meant the thing on his face right now was not a performance. He kissed her once, briefly, with the same quality of directness he brought to the rest of his life, and she kissed him back, and Nora between them said, in her small, careful voice, "Is that the end?" "No," Elena said. "That's the beginning." Nora considered this. "Okay," she said. and reached for Dutch's hand to go see about the cake. What followed the wedding was not a honeymoon, because this was a working ranch in May, and May on the northern plains had its own unromantic demands. The first week of their marriage included a difficult calving, a broken water pump that required 3 days to properly repair, and a dispute between the Mercer brothers that escalated to the point where Elena had to sit them both down at the kitchen table, like misbehaving children, and tell them flatly that she had neither the time nor the patience for whatever this was, and they needed to resolve it before supper, or she was going to resolve it for them, which she delivered with sufficient calm authority that both brothers looked at each other and then at her, and then agreed to resolve it. Garrick heard about this from Dutch and came to find her in the garden that evening with something on his face that was trying not to be amusement and failing slightly. "You could have let me handle that," he said. "You were with the cattle," she said. She was tying up the first tomato seedlings, which had gone in 2 weeks ago, and were doing exactly what Catherine's seeds should do after 6 years in proper storage, coming up dark green and determined. It was handled. "Sam Mercer doesn't take direction from—" He stopped. She looked up at him. He had the expression of a man who has started a sentence and realized mid-sentence that finishing it honestly will cost him something. "From people he underestimates," he said, which was clearly not what he'd originally planned to say, and was considerably more diplomatic. "Sam Mercer doesn't underestimate me anymore," she said. "That's what the fever was for." Garrick looked at the tomato seedlings for a moment. "No," he said. "I suppose it was." He crouched down and looked at the seedlings the way he looked at things he was evaluating seriously. The cattle, the fence lines, the weather. He touched one leaf with one finger, gently, which was not a thing she'd seen his hands do gently before outside of the night. He'd held her hands in the kitchen after the blizzard. "She would have been pleased," he said. Quietly, to the seedling or to himself, she wasn't entirely sure. "I know," Elena said. She had made a private decision, sometime in March, that Catherine Rowan was not a ghost to be afraid of, or a standard to be measured against, or a wound to be avoided. She was a woman who had loved this land and built something good in it, and died too young, and the best thing Elena could do for her memory was use what she'd left well. The seeds, the soil, the knowledge Calloway had passed on about what she'd grown, and how and when. The tomatoes, by July, were extraordinary. Summer came to Cold River Ranch with a generosity that felt almost apologetic after the winter it had followed. The garden produced with a kind of excess that kept Elena busy from early morning in a way that was entirely different from the busy of the winter. This was abundance busy, which required a different set of skills and a different category of problem. What to do with more tomatoes than the household could eat fresh, how to preserve the beans before they peaked, when to pull the onions, and where to braid and hang them. Calloway had become, improbably, her most consistent garden collaborator. He had strong opinions about the preservation of tomatoes that he presented as facts rather than preferences, which she had come to understand was simply how Pete Calloway communicated enthusiasm. She agreed with him often enough that the disagreements, when to pick, how long to process, whether the dill was better dried before or after flowering, had the quality of productive arguments between people who fundamentally respect each other's competence. "Your mother teach you this too?" he asked one afternoon, standing at the kitchen stove over a pot of tomatoes with his sleeves rolled up and his squint evaluating the color. "Most of it," she said. "Some of it I figured out myself." "The bean method," he said. "I haven't seen that before." "That's mine," she said. "I made it up the second year James and I had our farm. We had more beans than we knew what to do with, and I couldn't afford to waste them." Calloway stirred the tomatoes. "You had a farm," he said. "We did. Small. Ohio. It was a good farm." He was quiet for a moment. "What happened to it?" "James got sick," she said. She said it plainly because that was the only useful way to say it. "The medical costs. Then there was no James, and then there was no farm." Calloway nodded slowly. He understood the arithmetic of that, she knew. He was a man who had lived close enough to the edge to understand exactly how few bad seasons it took to lose everything. "Well," he said after a moment, "it's a decent garden you've got here now." "It is," she said. "Catherine built the bones of it." "And you grew something in it," he said. He looked at the pot. "These tomatoes are going to be the best we've put up in 6 years. I want to say that out loud now before I forget to." She looked at the side of his face. "Thank you, Pete." He made a small sound that wasn't exactly dismissive and wasn't exactly accepting and was entirely Pete Calloway. The thing Elena hadn't expected about the summer, the thing that caught her off guard in the best and most disorienting way, was the travelers. It started with a family passing through in June. A wagon with a husband and wife and 4 children heading west that had stopped at the ranch to water the horses. The wife had a fever Elena could see from 30 feet away, and she'd gone out to the wagon without really deciding to, and had introduced herself and asked how long the woman had been sick and what her symptoms were. And the husband had looked at her with the exhausted wariness of a man who has been terrified for 3 days and said, "Can you help her?" She could. It was the same fast-moving fever she'd treated in the bunkhouse in December, caught earlier this time, easier to manage. She brought the woman inside and treated her for 2 days and sent the family on their way with a small packet of her mother's dried preparations and written instructions in her careful handwriting. Word moves on the frontier the way water moves. It finds the low places and fills them and keeps going. By August, people were coming specifically. Not many. This wasn't a town. There was no sign. Nobody had announced anything. But a man with a badly infected hand from a fence wire cut. A woman whose child had croup and lived a half-day's ride east. An old trapper with frostbite damage from a previous winter that had never healed right. Elena treated them in the kitchen because it was the warmest, cleanest room on the ranch, and Calloway rearranged his domain with minimal complaint because he'd recognized several weeks earlier that this was happening, and that his opinions about it were largely beside the point. Garrett came home one afternoon in late August to find a stranger's horse in the yard, and a man he'd never seen sitting on the kitchen steps waiting, hat in his hands. He looked at the man and then at Elena, who appeared in the doorway behind him. "His daughter," she said quietly. "Fever. She's inside." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the man on the steps, who was looking at Garrick with the specific expression of someone on someone else's property who isn't sure of his welcome. Garrick nodded at him. "You want coffee?" he said. The man blinked. Yes, thank you." Garrett got the coffee himself and sat on the steps with the stranger while Elena worked inside. And that was the afternoon she understood, without needing it articulated, that he had made a decision about who his wife was and what she did, and he had decided to be the man who sat on the steps with the worried fathers while she did it. She told him that evening after the family had gone and the children were asleep, standing in the kitchen while she cleaned up. "You didn't have to do that," she said. He was at the table with his coffee and his ledger, which was where he spent most evenings, and he looked up at her. "He was scared," Garrick said. "Scared men need something to do with their hands. I gave him coffee and something to talk about. It's not complicated." She looked at him. "You're a decent man, Garrick Rowan." He looked slightly uncomfortable with this, which was exactly right. "Don't oversell it," he said. "I didn't want him pacing the yard and bothering the horses." She went back to cleaning up and did not push on it, because she didn't need to. She knew what he was. He knew what he was. The thing about decent people is they're usually the last ones to use the word about themselves. Thomas turned 9 in September, and Garrett gave him a horse. Not the horse he'd been practicing on. Darby's small, patient mare, who had taught him the basics with the tolerance of an animal that has educated many beginners. This was a young gelding, 3 years old, bay-colored, with an energetic temperament that was going to require the kind of patient, consistent work that Thomas had been developing all summer under Darby's quiet instruction. Thomas stood in the corral and looked at the horse, and looked at Garrick with an expression Elena couldn't read from the fence where she was watching. "He's mine," Thomas said. "He's yours," Garrick said. "You'll have to work him every day. He's got energy to burn, and if you don't manage it, he'll develop habits that are hard to undo." Thomas nodded very seriously, in the manner of someone receiving a briefing on an important assignment. "Darby'll help you," Garrick said, "but the responsibility is yours." Thomas looked at the horse again. The horse looked back at him with bright, curious eyes that had a lot of personality in them. Thomas reached out his hand slowly, the way Darby had taught him, from the side, letting the animal know you were coming. And the gelding dropped his big head and breathed on his palm. Thomas turned to look at Garrick. "I'll call him James," he said. It landed quietly in the corral, that name. Garrick held the boy's gaze and didn't look away from it. "That's a good name," he said. "Strong name." Thomas turned back to his horse, and Elena turned away from the fence before anyone could see her face. Nora found her voice the way she found everything, on her own schedule, in her own direction, surprising everyone by the path she chose. By October, she was talking with the steady, deliberate certainty of a child who had spent a year listening very carefully before deciding to speak, and who therefore had unusually clear opinions about things that other 5-year-olds hadn't fully formed thoughts on yet. She told Holt, one morning, that his cough was coming back and he should tell Elena. She told Sam Mercer, with complete seriousness, that the cloud formation to the northwest meant rain by afternoon and he should move the equipment he'd left in the yard. It rained by 3 o'clock. She told Garrick, one evening at supper, that the bay horse Thomas called James was going to try to get through the corral fence on the east side because she'd watched him testing it 3 days in a row, and he was going to find the weak spots soon. Garrick looked at her. Then he looked at Darby. Darby nodded slowly, which meant he'd seen it too. "I'll reinforce it tomorrow," Garrick said to Nora. "Today," Nora said. Garrick looked at the child across the supper table, this small, serious girl with Elena's dark eyes and a vocabulary of certainty that had apparently been building pressure behind that silence for a long time. He pushed back his chair. "Sam," he said, "finish your supper and come help me with the fence." Sam looked at Nora. Nora went back to her food. "Sure," Sam said. Dutch watched all of this with the profound contentment of a man watching something he helped build become something it couldn't have predicted. Elena caught his eye and he raised his coffee cup toward her, the same small gesture he'd made at the wedding. She raised hers back. The first full year of their marriage ended in November, which brought with it the anniversary of Elena's arrival at Cold River Ranch and a cold that was sharp and clear, instead of the killing weight of the previous winter. The ranch was different from what it had been. Not transformed, that was too large a word, and Elena distrusted words that made things sound easier than they were, but changed in the ways that matter. The herd was larger. Garrick had been cautious about expansion the previous 2 years, holding back until he was sure the land could support it. But with the spring and summer having been strong and the hay stores well above what the winter would require, he'd added 20 head in October, and the cattle count in the ledger that Thomas helped maintain had numbers in it that satisfied him. The garden was put to bed for the winter with the particular satisfaction of a garden that had given everything it had. The beds turned and composted, the seed stock saved in Catherine's tin alongside Elena's own additions, the shelves in the cold cellar lined with preserved tomatoes and beans and onions, and the various preparations Elena had made both for cooking and for medicine. It was objectively more than they needed for the winter. That excess was its own kind of statement. Holt had moved on in September, not unhappily, but because he was 23 and had been talking about going further west since July. And Elena had told him honestly that she thought he should go while the going was easy and young, and he'd looked at her with those uncertain, admiring eyes and said, "You're not going to try to talk me out of it?" And she'd said, "Why would I? You know your own life." He'd left with his horse and his gear and a packet of dried thyme for his cough, and had written a letter from the territory 3 weeks later that arrived covered in trail dust and said, among other things, that the sky out here was something else entirely, and he wished Dutch could see it. Dutch read the letter 3 times and kept it. A new hand had come on in October, a quiet young woman named Ruth, whose situation on arrival had been not entirely unlike Elena's own, though Elena would never say that directly to her. Ruth was 24 and capable, and had a wariness about her that Elena recognized and did not push against, because she understood better than most that wariness is not a flaw. It's information about what a person has been through, and it dissolves on its own when the environment earns its absence. Calloway had accepted Ruth's presence in the kitchen with a speed that surprised everyone until Elena understood that Pete had been waiting, without knowing it, for someone else to carry some of what he'd been carrying alone for 6 years. And Ruth's arrival had simply allowed him to set some of it down. The anniversary that mattered most, though, the one Elena marked in private, not on a calendar but in her own internal accounting, was the morning in late November when she stood on the porch of the main house with her coffee and looked at the yard. The sky to the north was the clear, cold blue that followed the season's first real cold snap. The horses were in the corral, including James the gelding, who had not gotten through the east fence because Garrick and Sam had reinforced it the same evening Nora had told them to. Thomas was already out there with Darby, moving through the morning routine with the focused ease of a boy who has been doing something long enough that it has become natural. From the bunkhouse, she could hear the low sound of voices, the ordinary morning sounds of people getting up and starting the day. Behind her, inside the house, she heard Nora's voice, clear and certain, saying something to Dutch, who had a habit of arriving early for the kitchen coffee and staying through breakfast. She heard Dutch laugh. She heard Garrick's boots on the hall floor. He came out and stood beside her without ceremony, with his own coffee, and looked at the same yard she was looking at. They stood there for a moment in the cold morning quiet. "Year ago today," she said. It wasn't a question. "About this time," he said. "Your wagon came in just before noon." She looked at the mud where the wagon had stopped. The yard was frozen now, the ruts from a season of work locked into the surface until spring came to soften them. She remembered standing in that mud with her broken suitcase and her two silent children and the wind trying to push her back the way she'd come. She had planted both feet. "I didn't know what this place was," she said. "Neither did I," he said. "Not really. Not until—" He stopped in the way he always stopped when he was being precise rather than eloquent. "Not until you showed me what it could be." She looked at him. He was looking at the corral, where Thomas was putting James through a slow trot with the patient, steady focus that Darby had taught him, and that Darby had, somewhere along the way, come to watch with the expression of a man watching something he's proud of. She thought about what it costs a person to keep going after the ground falls away. She thought about her mother's tin box and all that accumulated knowledge that her mother had built over 30 years so that Elena would have it when she needed it. She thought about James, who had sent her here with 11 lines of someone else's careful handwriting and the knowledge that she would find a way to use what she'd been given. She thought about all the things that had to happen, and all the things she had to refuse to surrender, and all the people who had to choose, over and over, to stay and do the next hard thing, for it to arrive at this. A cold November morning, a working ranch, a crooked cake, and a gray stone in a pocket, and a 5-year-old girl explaining cirrus formations to a man with a gap-toothed smile, a boy and his horse moving in the early light, a garden put to bed with more seeds than they started with. None of it was what she would have chosen if choosing had been available to her. She would have chosen James alive and the farm in Ohio and the life she'd built the first time. She would have chosen not to know what it felt like to bury the person you built everything with, but that choice had never been hers to make. The only choice she'd ever had was what to do with what was left after the loss. And she had taken what was left, the tin box and the 2 children and the last pieces of a shattered life, and she had planted them in the first available ground, and she had refused every single day to stop tending what grew. That was the whole of it. That was the truth she'd learned at the edge of nowhere, in someone else's dead wife's garden, in a kitchen she'd cleaned before anyone asked her to, in a bunkhouse full of sick men, and in a blizzard that tried to kill everyone, and in a kitchen floor proposal, and in a listing cake and a gray stone and a name given to a horse. You show up, you plant your feet, you do the next thing that needs doing, and you trust, not blindly, not without fear, but with the stubborn, practical faith of someone who has chosen to keep going, that the ground you're standing on can hold something if you give it long enough. Garrick put his hand over hers on the porch railing. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She turned her hand over and held his. Inside, Nora was telling Dutch about the clouds. Outside, Thomas was asking Darby something, and Darby was answering in his low, unhurried voice. From the kitchen came the sound of Calloway starting the morning fire, and Ruth's voice saying something that made him respond with a sound that was, improbably, something close to a laugh. The cold morning light came over the eastern ridge and spread across the frozen yard of Cold River Ranch. And Elena Rowan, she had taken the name without fuss, the way she did most things, stood on her porch and watched it come. It wasn't a perfect life. It was going to have bad winters and sick cattle and broken hinges and men who argued about snow removal and children who grew faster than she was ready for, and a husband who showed his feelings in ways that required translation, and a garden that would always, no matter how well she tended it, be at the mercy of weather she couldn't control. It was, in other words, a life. Real and specific, and entirely hers. She drank her coffee while it was still hot, because cold coffee is one indignity that serves no purpose, and she went inside to start the bread.